Rob here tonight, guys. We're going to give this a whirl. Ready?
Let's talk about what Jesus wears when he is in heaven. My name's Dakota Lee. I have a gift to see into the spiritual world beyond, and I have been visiting heaven. God's been letting me since I was 12 years old, and I love hanging out with Jesus. When Jesus is in heaven, he often wears his hair back in a low ponytail. And he'll wear sandals. He'll often be barefoot, and he'll wear very loose fitting clothing. I've seen him in an actual like tunic plenty of times. But he will dress sometimes for the occasion. This one time, just because he wanted to make me laugh, he appeared to me in a cowboy hat. And I love horses, but it was so I love cowboy hats, but it was so weird to see him in that. Jesus definitely has a sense of humor. But one thing about Jesus, he told me, he does not like tight fitting clothes.
Well, there we go, guys.
You know,
Jesus
amazing biblical commentarist.
We're crazy because we let a pope tell us what to do, but this woman is the pope of the evangelical world. So, all right. So here's the thing. I worked all day and did not get a chance to read any of this document. So anything I say tonight will be me plagiarizing what I heard Tim Gordon talk about. So I asked Eric to come on because I figured I have a feeling you guys are going to disagree a little bit, and I thought it would be interesting to see the two different approaches, because I don't want to go into this with, you know, the typical hermeneutic of suspicion. I want to go into this saying, is this possible that there could be unification of East and West? Because that would actually be an amazing thing. And I also want to go into it kind of looking at it as if maybe Francis is undoing some of the issues we have with Francis inadvertently, because I have heard commentators that I respect say things like maybe we should have an approach to the papacy more like the East has because of all the controversy. So we'll get into all of it. Before that, you know what? No promotions tonight. You guys know. Hit like, subscribe. We got a merch store. Go check that out. Something's going on with the local stream, and Rob's not here to fix it. So we're basically just on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube tonight. And we're going to get into it. So, okay, Eric, it's been a while since we saw you, man. How you been?
I've been great. Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Did you guys get a chance to read this document today?
So I read it once very quickly because I did work myself all day, but I woke up early. I got as far as I could. Then during lunch, read as much as I could. And then when I got home, I got to the end. And so it was a very light read. But I think I captured, what's being said.
I'm hearing it's stuffed with a lot of fluff that's like unnecessary and just like padding and stuff. So it's a very long document, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a very theologically dense one. So maybe, some of the, more important stuff is condensed down and stuff. So the thumbnail is obviously juxtaposing Pius IX with Francis. I think, Nick, you kind of had that feel to it, right? Like you were in the text today, you were kind of pointing out some of the things that don't kind of line up with what we've always seen the papacy as.
Yeah, I get a lot of my ecclesiology training from scholastic manuals. And so therefore I'm kind of, one of those rigid Roman 1950s people. And so a lot of this was, at least the copy that I got, I don't know about yours, Eric, but mine was 124 pages. That was the document list that I got. Yeah. So it was quite laborious. But yeah, I went through it this morning and a little bit this afternoon in my free time, because, that's what you got when you're 25 years old and don't have a wife and kids. You can read 124 pages for a show. Yeah, I found that a lot of it was really promoting, I would just say, particularly in its section on solutions. So for people who don't know, most of the document, it basically just gives a long history of the theology of the papacy. It first starts with scripture, moves through the patristics, all the way up to Vatican I, and then it dives into how does the papacy work potentially with the concepts of synodality. And then here are our, considerations, our practical applications of what we should do as a church. I think that's important to realize, because there's, of course, people who I think do have the quote hermeneutic of suspicion, which I don't necessarily 110% like believe in, but there's some people who do kind of have that. And they, are just immediately saying like everything's over. It's yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, you just chill. Like, it's just literally a recommendation list. That's all that it is. But I found in the recommendation list, particularly the discussions on reinterpreting Vatican I, potentially trying to get commentaries to go and reword it and to understand it in a very different way. This very much so plays in on the neo-modernist ideas in the 1950s, where they were taking existentialist philosophy and trying to apply it to various aspects of Catholic theology that were, eventually condemned by Pius XII and Humani Generis. This idea that while, dogmas per se aren't, just the amalgamations of Christian sentiments, right? As the classic modernist would say, they're good, right? They are revealed from God. Maybe we should just reword them, give different terminology to all the various theses and propositions, and therefore these will be more acceptable to the modern world,
More palatable.
more palatable for the modern world. The problem, of course, is that one who's doing that work, and when you start doing that for forever and ever and ever, as Pius XII talks about, you eventually just completely erode the dogmas themselves and they become meaningless. There's a specific reason why in traditional theology you do use scholastic terminology, you use Latin, so that it remains, if you will, as barriers or as walls against heretical teaching. And so I found this to be concerning, this whole idea about commentaries and like rewording the council and things along that nature, because while on the one hand, of course, in the grand scheme of things, more clarity in a traditional sense on dogmas, sure, that works, we can always get it. But if it's by individuals who are at least notorious on wanting to level every single hierarchical structure in the church in kind of a Marxist fashion, I don't really want you as my commentator. I wouldn't want you as my biblical commentator. I definitely don't want you as my ecclesiology commentator either. So those are some of my thoughts.
All right, Eric, your initial thoughts.
Well, I liked paragraph 9 because in paragraph 9, it specifically says that it's not intended to be like a summation of the Catholic magisterium. It's not even a response to the ecumenical responses. So in other words, this document was basically intending to summarize the responses to St. John Paul II's document calling for a reevaluation of the way in which papal primacy is exercised. And that was many years ago. And so people have been responding to John Paul II's call for the separated brethren to contribute what they would like to see, or what they would understand is a manageable view of the papacy and its exercise for them. So the document summarizes Eastern Orthodox responses to Ut Unum Sint, Anglican dialogues, Lutheran dialogues. I even have a physical copy of one of the texts, the Grupo de Doms. It's a French-Swiss get-together over the years. It's still going on, actually, of different Protestants and Catholics. I don't think any Eastern Orthodox are in that group. And other ecumenical ventures, that have been published. Some of them are private studies. All these responses to the call of JP2 and the Vatican's call for ecumenism. So this document is basically listing those responses. It's basically saying, hey, this is what we've collected from the ecumenical reflections from Orthodox, the Old Catholics, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Methodists, even gathered some stuff from the Baptists. And then
So
it says,
real quick, I was under the impression this was mainly aimed toward the East, and you're saying this is aimed towards all of the separated brethren.
no, I would say Lutheran and Anglican have more volume in the document.
Wow. Okay. Now you just wrote a book going over the papacy in the first millennium, essentially. I would think this was like right in your wheelhouse, right? I mean,
well, I mean, like I said, I've read the Anglican documents, ecumenical reflections that took place in the early 80s, late 70s. I've read Hans Kuhn. I mean, I've read all the ecumenical speculations, the Catholic Lutheran dialogues.
My condolences for reading Hans Kuhn.
A lot of them, some of them are actually good. Some of them are a waste of time, in my opinion. But
Eric's so charitable. I would have just been like, yeah, throw it all out.
But what I can tell you is that I had to read all that to write the book that I wrote. And I'm very troubled by much of what I read in the document, but I don't feel it, because paragraph 9 says that this is just a description of what everyone has said.
Exactly.
Even Baptists, even what Baptists have said would be workable for a papacy in their eyes. What I think, and it even says that it's not, that this particular document is not intended to be a response to those reflections, because when you read the document without the lens of paragraph 9, the document tends to be very irresponsible in not reminding the reader that what it says is not an affirmation. So it lists what the Lutheran dialogue said. The Anglican dialogue came to this conclusion. The Orthodox came to this conclusion. We heard this from the Baptist Church of Great Britain. We heard this from the Methodist Church. And it talks about it in such a way that it's almost like just telling everybody, hey, we're flexible. We could potentially manage with that. That sounds interesting. We didn't think about that. And oh my goodness, now we have a greater awareness of this and that. And so when you do that, the document itself tends to be betraying its preliminary remark in paragraph 9, I think, which is there should have been some more responsible, engagement, at least to tell the reader, this is what is claimed by this community, not necessarily what the Catholic Church is now proposing as workable. So that's my initial thoughts were that I'm glad it's just a study document. It was compared to like an instrumentum laboris, a working document. Questions are being raised, points worth observing, potential solutions and things like this, but nowhere near the level of, like a magisterial document.
Yeah.
Nowhere near that.
Mm-hmm.
And,
okay, so Tim Gordon made an interesting point today. He said, if you look through the first millennium, the church kind of has a particular view. Now, Eric, you just wrote a book on this, how the church's understanding of the papacy developed, right? So in the first millennium, it looks one way. Then as the second millennium comes in, you start seeing a more monarchical view of the papacy, where the Pope is a monarch. Is it possible that in the third millennium we'll have another development in the papacy? But to me, this seems like a devolvement more than a development in some ways, where it's like what I worry about is, and especially through what we've seen through Francis's papacy, is almost this this desire to have communion for everyone without any guidelines, you know. That means like if a Lutheran comes to a Catholic mass, they could just go, you know, look to your heart and just approach the Lord. And if you feel okay with it, you can go and receive. And that worries me severely because of the sacrilege that's involved with that, and the lack of understanding of the Eucharist within the Catholic communion alone is scary. Now to open that up to all these other communions could be devastating.
Yeah, look, we're plagued by the absence of exactitude. You know, we're being told over and over again that we're flexible. There's a possibility in these circumstances that we can do this, and there might be a set of conditions where we can do this, where we can do that. Whereas, you know, in ages past, we had that grace of people who were very clear. You know, we had the grace of clarity, and so nowadays, you know, there's so much elasticity in what the church is teaching, and so it's, you know, one guy's wrapped up on this side, another person's wrapped up on that side, and we're reading the same exact thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, and we're diametrically opposed in many things. And I think Pope Francis has, you know, contributed to that because he represents the new school of thought, you know, the last 50, 60 years. And but the papacy in the first millennium, I didn't listen to Timothy Gordon I heard some things he said. I didn't listen to the whole thing. But the papacy in the first millennium, you've got a mixture of things. You know, the data is it's not monolithic. In other words, the second millennium, there is a papal centralization. There's no doubt about that. But there were secular, social, and political contexts that simply caused the papacy to take its ancient principles and to apply them in the new context. So I'm very much with the late medieval historian Walter Ullmann, who, when he, you know, a lot of, like today, it's typical. If you go to Oxford, Yale, Stanford, you know, you're going to hear about the revolution of the Gregorian papacy, Gregory VII.
Yeah, because Gregory, you already start hearing Gregory say things like the Bishop of Rome cannot err, things like that, right? Like it really is Gregory who starts making grand assertions about the papacy, I think, right?
Well, so I mean, it's in a context where it backfired, so it gets a lot. It gets a lot of, you know, notoriety because of that. But Gregory VII, if you read his letters, you know, he's quoting Pope Damasus. He's quoting events that happened in the East from centuries ago. So a guy like Walter Ullmann, who's, you know, like I said, he was a medieval historian / historical theologian. He wrote a couple books on the papacy that are still referenced today in you know, monographs and theses and dissertations and all that. But he says, look, what happened with, you know, Innocent III, Hildebrand, and the you know, Cluniac reform, Gregorian reforms, and following are they were taking the basic Petrine theory that was well established in the church for generations and decades and centuries, and was basically just bringing it to a more visible enforcement.
Yeah,
you know, and so that did mark a change, you know, especially because the state was trying to flex its biceps more, and we saw the papacy grow its biceps in the first millennium when the emperor tried to do the same thing. But the problem then is the papacy didn't really have a military, you know.
This
So
eventually winds up leading to like the investiture controversy, right? Like who has the authority, the church or the state, and things.
yeah, you know, but then, you know, there were also very there were articulated discussions back and forth. You know, they weren't just saying, okay, it's all the state, it's all the church. They were trying to find a middle ground, but the middle grounds just weren't working. And that's why
Yeah.
Rome said, okay, this is what it's going to be. I mean, in an age where you can't really keep tabs on what's going on 6,000 miles away, you know, within a week or two, you have to make a clear rule. This is how it's going to be. You know, in fact, you know, like one of the great changes that took place in the second millennium that, you know, like Orthodox and Anglicans want to see peeled back is Rome's election of bishops and the necessity of Rome to approve of the Eastern elections for the you know, the Byzantine rite and the other rites in the East. That actually didn't start with Rome. It was actually the bishops in the West who pushed for Rome to be the one to elect bishops and to finally approve episcopal elections. And so in many ways, the papacy was looked to as a savior, not from the head down, but from the body up. So I'm not sure what Tim said. I'd have to, you know,
He was just saying that, you know, you know, the possibility of a new, this is how things develop. And it seems so. All right. So the other thing I'm hearing, you know, of course you have Jay Dyer and all the guys in the East saying, oh, we were right the whole time. We were right the whole time. Does this document actually affirm their position or anything? Because it seemed to me the little bit that I saw was just like, look, for the sake of unity, maybe we would still allow the East to hold their own juridical authority, but, you know, use Rome in a case where, you know, you guys would have a role if we have another council that we'd have roles for you there. It would also be that Rome could maybe help you guys figure out some things where you have to, you know, it would always be, if there's a disagreement, you could appeal to Rome to find, you know, to have them be the decider in that agreement, but not that they have to fall into submission as the church in the West is required to do.
Well, like I said, I mean, I just spoke. So, Nick, would you like to go and answer that question before I throw out what I think?
Yeah, is the East is claiming we were right the whole time. You guys are even admitting it now. Is that accurate to say from this document?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in a general sense, it depends on, I guess, really how you read it. I think that Eric is right. If you read through the document with the absence of paragraph 9, you're going to run into a situation where you could come away with that interpretation. I think that you definitely can see a desire to have that interpretation even from some Roman prelates. And the issue, I think, is twofold. So there's two thoughts that come to mind. To your point earlier about the idea of, you know, I guess it was Tim Gordon's theory about, you know, you see in the first millennium a more decentralized church, and then in the second millennium a more hierarchical, monarchical church. And, you know, of course, with the reality is that our Lord obviously founded a monarchical church.
Yeah.
That, you know, that is part of Vatican I's dogmatic understanding. It's clear in, you know, every single manual on ecclesiology that you can find that's not written by Hans Küng, perhaps. And, you know, it's actually, and it's decent. And so therefore we have to recognize that. And so whereas the first millennium, maybe we have scant evidence, well, we have scant evidence of a lot of things in the first millennia. You know, we would love to have more information in comparison to like where we are in the digital age.
Yeah, right.
And
everything's instant online. You have access to every single thing anyone's ever said at any time now.
Exactly. And you've always seen attempts from, whether it is, you know, with the schism in the East or the conciliar heresy that popped up in the Council of Basel, or even, you know, and this is my own opinion, but the spicy stuff, right? At the Second Vatican Council with the whole discussion on collegiality, right? There was the whole conservative wing that was very, very concerned about particularly in the first set of documents, the total abandonment of the Roman See as, you know, the primate, if you will, of the entire church. And that got dialed back a bit, you know, before its initial passing. I think, though, that the issue that we're going to have is that you're going to see Roman prelates who want to see this placate to the East, but the East is never going to say yes. Even let's just say, for instance, sake of story, we were to say, all right, yeah, you guys were right. Why don't we all just get back together? There's still so many other issues that we have to overcome. What about the issues with purgatory, the Immaculate Conception? What about the moral issues between the different, rights that are over there alone? Are the Russians
the
going to
procession of the Spirit?
exactly? I mean,
Yeah, we
I
still
think
been having out the Filioque, right?
exactly. Eric, you talked with Christian Wagner, I think it was about 10 months ago, and you guys discussed the Filioque. It was a great interview. And one of the things you guys brought up is the reality that whereas the papacy, you can definitely get more into the weeds looking at the patristic era. The Filioque, it's just page after page after page of just, I pick a page on the subject and there you go. It's in East and West, etc. Not until you really get to a later Byzantine time do you start to see some controversies develop. Like, what about all of that? And so the issue, though, I think, is that Rome, with the desire to be synodal, I think there's a lot of people up there who would say, well, why don't we just bypass all of this and just have some type of like symbolic kumbaya where we do kind of work together in some type of function, but we're never going to really get to the actual dogmatic things that touch upon the deposit of faith. That thing that Christ left us whenever he went up into heaven, that are going to have to be hammered out. So those are kind of my initial thoughts.
Yeah. So let me go to that question. Can the East say that this is a victory? No, I don't think so, because for a few reasons. The first reason is, when you listen to streams by the Orthodox on like the Chieti document, the Alexandria document, the Ravenna statement, they're treating these things as like Rome's authoritative documents.
Yeah.
And even when they sometimes recognize that it's not, they try to prime the pump that, okay, but this is like, this is where it's all heading.
Mm-hmm.
This document is just the same. It's not even a joint declaration.
Yeah.
This is just a
study.
a study. Yeah. It's just a study, and it's collating. It's a collection of responses from Methodists, Baptists, Lutherans, Anglican. In fact, the Protestant world gets more volume than the Orthodox in the document. So I don't know how an Orthodox person can say that this is a victory. At most, it would be Rome's becoming. What you hear in the document, and what I feel, let me not use that word, but what I fear is, Rome is just trying to, it's almost like there's a silent admission that none of us are really all right at the end of the day. Like, Catholicism may not be perfectly right. Orthodoxy may not be perfectly right. Protestantism may not be perfectly right. But we can meet in the middle, where we can leave the tradition that we all rest our feet in now, and find a new expression that's nothing we've ever seen. And that's frightening.
Scary, man.
It's frightening. So that's why the document can be, it begs, like one of the guys I was texting today, he said it begs abuse, because like Nick was talking about at the opening, where they were talking about the distinction between the expression of doctrine and the substance of meaning, like what the meaning is. And so they're saying, look, Vatican I had all these expressions, right? And this is coming from the mouths of Lutherans, mind you. They're quoting Lutheran theologians who are saying, look, we Lutherans can appeal to this distinction between the, I think it's enuncial, I think it's called, enunciabile, the enunciabile, which is the expression of doctrine, and then the res, the what it is, what the meaning is. So Vatican I might have said all these things about jurisdiction and infallibility, but really the meaning was they just wanted peace. And so now that we know that they just wanted peace, we can be in conformity with that, with our idea of how to get peace.
Yeah.
So in other words, they're saying, no, we can agree with Vatican I. We agree with its substantial meaning, which is to be distinguished from its enunciabile, its expression. So go ahead.
But what I love about having Nick on is because Nick is constantly reminding me of how much different the church spoke in times past. So because he always takes the scholastic approach and he's always, coming at it from that perspective, because I'll tell you right now, even under John Paul II, you hear this language that the church in the East and the church in the West are the two lungs breathing in the church. And there's this desire for us to want unity, obviously, right? But there are very big distinctions between the church in the East and the church in the West. And only the church in the West has the ability to actually figure these things out and make a declaration on them. The church in the East doesn't even have that ability. So they are quarreling with each other and don't even have agreement on many things. They're not even in communion with each other. And then just from a common sense perspective, bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth, the kingdom is hierarchical. It has a structure, and there has to be a head of that kingdom on earth. It just has to be. And it has to be the Pope as the prime minister of Christ. And that's the way the kingdom takes shape on earth.
3 thoughts that came to mind. So one, yes, if this was pre-1950, a document like this would have come out where they would have, if you will, taken the ideals and the pulses of all the various different denominations. What you would have seen is they would have had a team of Dominicans respond to every single one of them and prove from the sources where the Roman doctrine is correct and how maybe the Eastern Orthodox or the Protestants are twisting scripture or misinterpreting the fathers or something to that effect. Second, this whole desire of just, kind of a kumbaya spirit of let's kind of put down the differences and agree in this vague substance way, at its heart, I think just has this modernist ideals of vital immanence in the sense that it's like, well, okay, we each have our own religious experiences that we're bringing to the table. You Protestants really connect with the Bible, and so you interpret the papacy, therefore, through that light. The Orthodox, you guys like your own traditions and your own, Eastern fathers. You're approaching it from that tradition. And we in the West, we've seen it kind of develop in this sense, etc. Who knows who is really right at the end of the day? We all think that each one of us has, value to bring to the table in this discussion. So let's water down as much as we can and agree on as much as we can so that we can maybe hammer something out in some type of symbolic manner. And then the third and final, I would say, is that both of these lead to is ultimately in its practice, the eroding and the abandoning of what the Petrine See is for, which is, you mentioned unity, Anthony. Like we want to have unity. Unity with the East is good, but it has to take place in the unity of faith, right? Yeah. Before the unity of governance. Unity of governance is important, but if it's not accompanied with the unity of faith, that we all believe in the same thing as it was always understood, then unity becomes worthless, and we may as well go down to, the local Legion Hall and just wrap our arms around each other and sing songs.
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from. And like I said, the document is not responsible to, it says it's written for scholars in the ecumenical movement. So it tries to already tell you, okay, this is written for the club, the club of ecumenical ideas, but it's the tyranny of inexactitude. There's Rome is being very elastic, and Catholic theologians right now I'm thinking of one of the chief delegates. Well, I don't know if he was. I think he was acting in that capacity at the Chieti meeting. Monsignor Paul McPartlin, and he wrote a book. It's called "The Service of Love: Papal Primacy, the Eucharist, and Church Unity." And I think his ideas were driving the Chieti's, their summary of their, their findings. And if you, I've listened to him lecture, I've read his book, have had some, discussions with him before. And what I get from him and what I get from people that I've spoken to is just this, it's very open. We're just open, and whatever is put on the table, we will figure a way out to incorporate it. And so what you have there is the absence of any care for contradiction.
Yeah, like anything but disagreement. Let's just do everything we can to ignore these elephants that are throughout the room and just pretend they're not there and just go along for the sake of getting along.
Right. Where is the zeal for a coherent doctrine?
There is none anymore.
A coherent philosophy of thought that you can be confident with. I don't see that in this document. Of course, again, we keep reminding ourselves it's just a study. It's just all these things. Yeah. But I still think it's kind of, it's sloppy. And there's some things that were, helpful to be reminded about. There are, the principle of subsidiary, the method of appeal, appellate jurisdiction. Those were some of the things that Ravenna, Chieti talked about when it comes to the East. I would like to see Rome's authority peeled back in that sense, I think that appeals, appellate, and the principle of subsidiary, that doesn't diminish the doctrine of Vatican I. I think it could work well with Vatican I.
Well, even the situation of Bishop Strickland getting removed, right? He had no canonical process. He was just yanked out of there. Like, I don't know if the papacy was ever intended to have that kind of I guess the Pope does have obviously he does, right? That's why like a lot of people, I remember, especially after the McCarrick stuff or when Benedict stepped down, everybody was debating all this stuff about Francis, and I'm like, what's the difference? He clearly has full juridical authority over the church, so like all of our arguments are kind of meaningless because the man does have that juridical authority to do whatever he pleases.
But see, like, I think that I get the like that line a lot. I think that's a really simplistic way to even read the whole discussion behind supreme jurisdiction. Because it's like, on the one hand, does the Pope have the ability to remove a bishop? Well, clearly he can. But you also have to take into effect, looking outside the prism of positive law, the whole issues of real morality, and say, okay, is this something that's justified? Is there a court of appeals that are set up by the Roman structure, which there are, that are just kind of being overread? I think of course, the most the OG cancel culture bishop, right, Archbishop Lefebvre. The whole issue when it came between him and Rome in the beginning was that Rome would, there was liberals inside of the Curia that did not want to hear his case. So the famous story, of course, of Cardinal Bea, who, when Archbishop Lefebvre repealed the whole, censor upon him, telling him to shut down the seminary, he appealed it, as was his right under canon law. And Cardinal Bea called, the Roman courts and said, yeah, don't even bring up his case. We look at that and we say, if this was a secular government, we'd say, yeah, this is kind of like America in 2024. It's a banana republic. Well, it was kind of a banana court system going on there. Same thing. You have to understand everything within the context of the divine law influencing the positive law and how that's supposed to be played out.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Oh, I'm sorry, Anthony.
No, go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say this is very important because what's very interesting to me is that Rome seems so interested in all these ecumenical dialogues and all that, but I never see Rome personally in the person of the Pope or in the theologians that are appointed to these committees to revisit the concept of papal failure in history. So Pope Honorius, Pope Vigilius, and other examples. I mean, that would have been wonderful to bring up in this document.
Yeah.
Honorius, I did a Control F this morning. I said, imagine if Honorius comes up in this find, or Vigilius. No, they never talk about it. And to me, I think that would be, I don't think you really come full circle until you're studying both the papal success and the papal failures. So that way we have a balance, like what Nick is talking about here. If a pope came out and said, I think, in some kind of magisterial capacity, he says, I teach that everyone's diet from here on out should be exclusively bananas.
Yeah.
Big L.
And I think it's a matter of faith and morals. What are you going to do? What are the Pope's plainers going to do? Like, well, we got to submit because he says it's faith and morals. No, you're going to find them saying, well, that's not faith and morals. It's so obvious. Oh, is it? Can you have the power to identify what category against his own opinion?
There'd be a few out there who would say, well, before the time of Noah, they only ate vegetables and fruits, and so he's trying to restore us to almost a Garden of Eden style people. That's what he's doing, Eric.
Well,
there is a place to outwardly disagree and oppose. Yeah.
I just remember. I remember even hearing Flanders talk about this years ago, but a lot of guys saying, I think, everybody's talking about Vatican II, but I think that maybe Vatican I and all the declarations on papal infallibility maybe need to be revisited, and really thought out a little bit deeper, because it doesn't seem like they were actually, developing. Because look, Nick, you're shaking your head, but what I hear all the time is, the Pope is infallible only in cases when he's speaking ex cathedra, but there's a lot more that Vatican I says. Like the Vatican I really does tell us we need to, there's a lot more there. I don't have it offhand in my head.
No, and I don't disagree. Where I depart from Tim, and of course we all know he's a homie, so no hate to Tim or anything. But where I disagree actually with Tim is that where I agree. Well, I'll first start with I agree. Where I agree with them is that post Vatican I, particularly because of the historical setting that you find the council in, both before and after, you do see a lot of weight placed on the papacy for answers. Around the world, people are being persecuted by Freemasonic revolutions left and right. They're looking to the Pope for guidance, etc. Makes sense. However, Vatican I is very clear, but Vatican I is written for primarily, especially in its commentaries, for theologians. And so we know the instances in which the Pope is infallible, not just the extraordinary magisterium, but also the ordinary and universal magisterium. However, I think what people forgot in that interim period, and this is what you see some theologians at the time concerned about, is the non-infallible magisterium, or what's sometimes called more properly, the authentic magisterium, which can, be safe and perfect and fine if, of course, it consults the sources of revelation before its teaching. And what you see now primarily in the documents post Vatican II and Vatican II itself, because Paul VI calls it in its theological note authentic magisterium, you see very much so this third rung, this low level, if you were a tier of authority that we should ideally have submission of intellect and will to, but that's very different than having submission of divine and Catholic faith to. But I think, unfortunately, so many Catholics kind of ad nauseum and almost as kind of a knee-jerk reaction always kind of go back to what Vatican I did fear, which was, kind of a total, exaltation of everything the Pope says up to that level of extraordinary or ordinary universal magisterium. So I think what we need to do is, as a church, be better at talking about the authentic magisterium. And that's where theologians debate, can a Pope teach error in this capacity? Can he not? Of course, Eric, you're pretty famous about the whole discussions right now about papal safety, right?
Mm.
And that falls clearly in the realms of the authentic magisterium, because you of course agree, and your interlocutors on the other side agree, that the ordinary universal magisterium and the extraordinary magisterium, you're not even talking about that. It's always infallible in that case.
Right.
So, okay. So if you look throughout history at all the crises that the church has gone through, right? Even something like Honorius, what I see going forward is after Francis, I kind of see something, whether it's a council or something, but some way that they start being a little more clear about what exact authority the Pope does have. Like, I almost think this conversation needs to be had, especially post Francis, because I think we're all just thrown for a loop under Francis. It's like, wait a minute, what's going on? Like, we've never even encountered anything like this in our lifetimes for the most part. Or maybe most people didn't think about it because we just had this trust in the papacy up until Francis, and then everything kind of got shaky. So I'm hoping that some of these things do get answered after him.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely going to have to be the case. I mean, like I said, we need to study, we need to study the history, the reality, and the possibility of papal failure, and what are the duties of the baptized in those circumstances. I mean, we've strained, we've gone far with explaining in great detail on soteriology. We've gone far with teaching about the nature of Christ, the two natures of Christ, Christology, theology, the beatific vision, the sacraments. We've gone far in our definitions, but we need to revisit this issue of conditional obedience, papal failure, and things like this, because otherwise we're always going to be wondering, what do we do in this instance? What do we do in that instance? And now that, like Anthony said, now that we're watching it, I mean, in many cases we've been watching it. Like when I was an Anglican, I already knew about many things that I knew were not correct, that were being done from the papacy downward. And so
that's funny because I didn't, right? So I don't, I don't start looking back at those mistakes until 2018. Like I never even, I was telling these guys, I think a couple of shows ago, just even the Assisi meetings and things, I never knew about any of that stuff until Francis comes, and all of a sudden we start going, wait a minute, what's going on here? And that's when your eyes start going, wait, everything's kind of been a little bit different since this council, and it is a different posture the church takes completely towards the world. And this document is just kind of a furtherance of those initial positions to just, okay, let's overlook the dogmatic approach to everything, but those dogmatic approach, like some people really do need those dogmatic approaches and that clarity of doctrine, because we all do, but
everybody does.
That's actually what converted me. What converted me of like the final nail was the church's teaching on birth control, because I saw the whole world around us caved on that one teaching. And I was like, wait a minute, why is the church the only, like the final bastion of clarity on this issue? And it's what stood out to me that said, okay, this is different than every other Christian, Christian confession.
Yeah, to Erick's point, I really agree with him about the need to go back and discuss papal failure, because he reminds me of, in the famous manual, the Sacra Theologia Summa, the discussion on their treatise De Ecclesia. They ask the question, these are Thomistic Jesuits in the 1950s. They ask the question, can the Pope teach heresy in the authentic magisterium? Right, so in this non-infallible capacity. And they give one paragraph.
Yeah.
Literally one paragraph to that discussion. And they basically say, it is our opinion that this could never happen. And the theological note to that if you guys are astute in your theology, is a probable opinion, which is the lowest level of certainty. You can hold that position or you can freely reject that said position. My point is to illustrate they have one paragraph, which is nothing. It doesn't address a vast majority of questions that we could have long term. And then to your point, Anthony, I think the reality is that we all need dogma because the dogma is the faith and the morals that Christ gave us in the deposit of faith that have been clearly expounded by the church for 20 centuries. But when you do see the introduction of modern philosophy into the seminaries, particularly post 1960, and then of course individuals before the 1960s tinkering around with this. For instance, you look at Dominique Chenu, and he famously talks about, like, we're waiting to discover God and his religion in the future, like what it will become. And you're just like, all right, well, there is like a really charitable way of reading that. But then I'm also recognizing there's just a face reading at that, that's not good. But that whole influence, whether it be the God of surprises or don't proselyte the Orthodox, while simultaneously allowing in Dignitatis Humanae for false religions to proselytize in Catholic nations, or birth control, like, Catholics shouldn't be breeding like rabbits, and then the ambiguous comments when it comes to contraception, when it comes to certain diseases in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. This marrying of the world and the church through, again, this neo-modernistic thought is what is going on. And the way that we get out of this, of course, is by the power of Christ and the grace of Christ. But it has to be not just, of course, the restoration of the liturgy, which is what everyone focuses on, but it has to be the restoration of scholasticism and going back to that and training the theologians up again to do this.
Eric, let me ask you something, because the last time we had you on, we talked about how even though Francis keeps pushing this boundary, there is still the protection of the Holy Ghost, that he doesn't put these things into dogma, right? Like there's still this line he can't cross where he has to dance around with this wishy-washy language and all that. What do you think are some of the dangers that can come from this document, though? Are there real red flags that we should be looking out for and dangers ahead?
Well, yeah, the danger is, it's asking everybody what they want, and basically saying that might work.
Yeah.
Not saying it will work, but hey, you're saying this, that's extremely valuable. Thank you. Next. Oh, you say that? Well, that sounds very interesting. I didn't think about that. We have a new awareness now. Let me jot that down and I'll get back to you. Like, it's just constantly telling in the document, it mentions how there were historical contexts wherein, like, Vatican I happened and Trent happened. And it says, look, in the late 19th century, you had this sense, there was liberalism and all this sense of the dissolution of truth and objectivity. And that's why we looked for the centralization in papal power. Mm-hmm. So it's like they're recognizing that there was a contextual cause to that emphasis at the time. But they don't realize that in this document, they're just inviting us back into the dissolution of truth by getting the consensus of all the different opinions, mm-hmm. and not adequately saying this will be responded to, or this will be corrected. They're not looking for ways in which the other denominations contradict us.
Yeah.
They're looking at ways to take what we've always seen as contradictions and basically uncontradictize them, and with no substance that actually alleviates the contradiction. So the harm in the doctrine is, if you want to trace out the concept, it's the extermination of Christianity altogether, because
It's just the watering down of the faith until it's meaningless.
Liberalism.
exactly. And but they'll deny it. They'll always deny. They always deny that it's indifferentism. They'll always deny that it's relativism. In other words, that's what we're right now. We're in the tyranny of relativism that denies that it's relativism. You know,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
crazy, right? Because Benedict warned about this dictatorship of relativism.
Well, interestingly, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I wanted to say something about Ratzinger, because he comes up in this.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, Ratzinger himself, you know, some of his writings, he's great, right? I like him. You know, he's one of the greatest theologians in the 20th century. I don't want to denigrate him in any way, but he did say some things that, you know, it ventured into this kind of speculation, and so it was just to see him talk against relativism the way he did, that was beautiful. But what we needed that to be more practical in the church. We need that to be more practical. And the way that we understood that in ages ago was to be clear in our teaching, clear in our practice.
Yes.
So Vatican II, you know, for example, even if you don't think it has any material errors, right? You still have some crazy spots where it's like they're open to the idea of atheists being saved, right?
Yeah.
Now, where in the tradition of the church have we ever speculated on imagining something like that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that it's heretical. I mean, that's another discussion. But just by speculating on the availability of salvation for somebody who doesn't believe in God, there's a danger with that. You know, it's making Christianity more elastic than it ever was. And
well, right off the bat today, it's because here's what I find when I'm having conversations with Protestants, I become a Pope-splainer because they'll say things like, "What do you mean?" I'm arguing with a Protestant, and he's like, "Why are you even having this conversation with me? Your Pope blesses Muslims," and I'm like, "No, that's not what's going on. The Pope seeks fraternal dialogue with Muslims, and he wants peace." But it's like, but really, I'm like, why are we talking to the Muslims? What's going on here? You know, so I find that within the family, I'll talk to my brothers about, I'm really having a hard time with Dad. But when I'm talking to Protestants, I find myself having to go, no, that's not really what's going on there. You know, it's a really difficult time to be Catholic with the current hierarchy in place, man.
I find it's actually easier for me, actually, just because oftentimes, at least, you know, in the Deep South, there's still a lot of vestiges of like legit anti-Catholic sentiment. And so whenever they find out that I'm and I don't want to be like as a Catholic in and of itself, but like critic of the things that Pope Francis does, they're like, oh, okay, well, we can actually have a rational discussion.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think like two things came to mind. One, well, I guess maybe three. One, I would say, I don't know, Eric. I feel like if Ratzinger's really up there on your list of 20th century theologians, you got to get a longer list because Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange is the greatest theologian of the 20th century.
But Nick, I'll tell you what Eric's doing there, because I do it all the time too. People have a nostalgia for Benedict, and if you don't preface it with, look, yeah, we like Benedict was good in some areas, like people just jump down your throat and they don't want to actually listen to anything.
Oh yeah,
you're saying.
No, I know.
It's a situation we're all kind of put in right now. I'm sure Eric has plenty of criticism of Benedict and doesn't actually think he's the greatest theologian of the 20th.
No.
When did he see?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, no, I know Eric wasn't. It reminded me though of one time when I was waiting to serve the Latin Mass in the diocesan setting. The Vicar General of the diocese came in, and he was just like, "Young man, have you ever heard of Ratzinger? Because he heard I was a theology student. And I was like, yes. And then I asked him, have you ever heard of Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange? And he's like, no. And this is the vicar general of the whole diocese.
The vicar general of the diocese never
He's
heard
like,
of him.
no. And then the priest who's in the corner, he's like, you've never heard of the greatest theologian of the 20th century?
At
like,
least that. Nick, what's a good
Yeah.
starter book of Garrigou-Lagrange? Like if somebody wanted to jump in, do you have like a good starter book?
I'd say 2. So if you're wanting to get into like what he really was passionate about, which was mystical and ascetical thought, 3 Ages of the Interior Life, it's the classic go-to. It's phenomenal. It's going to be really practical for you. If you're wanting more of his academic books, definitely check out the Thomistic Sense. It's a very good book, a new translation by Dr. Minard, who's a friend of, I think, Erick's in mine. He's a really, really good guy, Matthew Minard. But yeah, I was going to say 2 things. So one, to Erick's point on this kind of like you can be right and you can be right, and this is kind of reintroducing us to the liberal paradigm. I fully agree, because I think that at the root of this, it is what Archbishop Lefebvre said, where he says the root of all of these problems is liberalism. It is this idea of I have my rights, you have your expression, I have my expression, and we all come together in this equal playing field, truth and error on the equal playing field, and truth never at the end of the day comes out on top, because there's no real division that should be taking place of truth. Because if I was to, be triumphalistic over you, then that would be quelling your rights. And then to Anthony's point, I think when we go back and we look at the reality of, the discussions around, Pope splaining and things along that nature, is it helpful or not in the context of dialoguing with Protestants? I think, of course, you have to be very astute in your theology, but I find that people are way more open actually to the Catholic faith. In my experience, I've had way more people who are open when you can at least admit the errors, because the thing is, Protestantism may be a heresy, but they still have the faculty of reason. And the thing is that when we go on and on and on, and we're like, hey, let me let my life's career be making 4-hour-long daily streams, defending a 3-sentence phrase that the Pope said in an interview. That's not only
I wonder who Nick's talking about.
That's not only a really sad existence for your one and only life on this earth, but then 2, Protestants don't take you seriously.
That's
Eric,
right.
I don't know if you know, but my most commented on video ever is our conversation about him. I still, every day I'll get comments popping up. This is uncharitable. It's not very nuanced. I'm like, oh great, here we go.
Well, it's unfortunate that we can't talk about things anymore. It's like the big influencers out there have an effect, and we I think it's right to speak to misinformation, and because otherwise, if you say that we should be held hostage to falsehood, our principles are violated, so I don't, it doesn't matter what, the person thinks, if they're well-intentioned or not. The fact of the matter is when you mislead people like that, it causes injury, causes injury to the truth, and therefore injury to the gospel, so but yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, I had man, I gotta keep this vague. Another creator who's definitely he's on the trad recovery side of things, right? He's somebody from that end, where I was discussing the dangers of how feminized the church has become, and talking about the dangers of having women in the sanctuary and girl altar boys and all these things. And he actually yelled at me because he said, well, clearly the church is heading in this direction, so you need to stop talking about these things, because if the church is heading in that direction, that means you're the one that's wrong and not the church. And it's like, I see the real world effects of these things.
Yeah.
I see how many people have lost their faith from these things. I see a world that now thinks men can be women if they put women's clothing on, because they're learning in the church itself that gender is not that important from the church itself. So for that's really the confusion that it comes down to at the ground level.
Yeah, and I think one of the scary parts about it is uh, psychologists and psychiatrists, they have all the fancy, you know, lingo for this, but there are things that happen in relationships sometimes. You know, if you have like a really bad marriage and an abusive husband, for example, and the wife just takes it, and eventually over time she sees her as the cause of the problem, and she admires him because he's the one that's giving her a life, you know. And you know, her sister comes by and says, "Hey, that bruise on your face there, you know, what's that from?" You know, and it's just, no matter who sees her and who tries to talk to her about this situation, she's the problem. Her husband is the savior, no
Yeah.
matter what he does.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
I think a lot of people, their well-being, their peace of mind is so welded to a healthy papacy that no matter what happens from the papacy, he could deck you, he could get you a right cross, he can punch you in the stomach. It's never him. It's never it's always he's actually the savior. We just need to read him the right way.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's getting to the point now where I think I'm seeing that in some people.
Oh
Mhm.
man, the Pope Francis is the most base Pope ever meme is just so exhausting. It's
Or
guys, stop
Fernandez.
it.
They're saying Fernandez is based. You know,
Oh
they
my
say he's
gosh,
been
man.
based.
Like he
I
should
don't
be
use
the
the term
next
based.
Pope. It's like, are you guys like what are you guys? What yeah, it's
What
Stockholm syndrome.
It's Stockholm syndrome and it's theological crack. Like, what are you smoking? The reality is, I was talking to a couple friends after mass a couple weeks ago, and we were actually discussing this whole thing. I think I may have told you this story, Anthony, on one of our shows, but like I was like, okay, why are all of particularly like the Nick Fuentes Groyper Catholics, who most of them are below the age of 21, and they've only voted once, and they were 10 years old when Pope Francis came into power, etc., and they've been Catholic for a year. Why are they all going down this rabbit hole of
It's because
Pope
of Fuente.
Francis is based? Oh yeah, I think 100% it's partially that, because people are just, group think it's easier than thinking. However, the reality is, at the same time, they'll say, well, there's so many more people to criticize in our day than Pope Francis. He should be like, at the end of the list, et cetera, et cetera. And my point was, in a charitable, correct sense, the Holy Father is the one who is we should be the most concerned about, because he is the one who has he is the principal source of unity in the church, and he is the one entrusted by our Lord to lead the world to Christ. I think about, when we think about that famous passage from John 20, when our Lord tells, or John 21, when our Lord tells St. Peter, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, right? He says this 3 times, and we often think about it in the context of the church, and it's true. The Pope is supposed to feed us the true doctrine. And when you go back to, again, ecclesiology manuals, they'll ask the question, how do you know tradition is being respected in the church? They ask that question. And you know what they say? If the traditional magisterium, a term you don't hear very often anymore, if the traditional magisterium, which is the magisterium that does not insert novelties into it, passes on the same tradition to every single generation, that's how you know that the tradition is being respected in the Catholic Church. The Pope is the one who is supposed to, according to our Lord, feed the lambs with the sound word, with that sound milk of doctrine, with the tradition of the faith. So he's the one that we should be most concerned about, because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day whether or not Trump becomes president or Biden becomes president. At the end of the day, will souls be saved? And are these actions destroying lives in the context of the spiritual life? And I think we all know people who have apostatized because of the things Pope Francis has said.
It seems
Oh
like the
yeah.
church has completely abandoned the mission of saving souls. That I think is the scariest thing.
Which she's the
While
reason.
denying that she's abandoning it.
Exactly, exactly. And that's the sad thing, is that how do you, on the one hand, have the reality that our mission is to glorify God and to save souls, but then in tandem with that, don't convince the Orthodox, don't try to convert them, don't proselytize, etc., etc. But we can allow other religions to proselytize in our own countries, etc., etc. Of course, these are the statements of the Pope. They're not magisterial. Thank the good Lord, etc. The gospel will always win at the end of the day. So people have to remember that. But how can you have this contradiction? It has to be neo-modernism.
Eric, do you have you been accused of being a crypto setter yet?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, you're
Yeah,
in good
actually,
company.
somebody reached out to me in private messaging and said, "Do you believe that Pope Francis is the Pope?" And
Who is this?
it was somebody who he's a former fan of mine. Who I he's
Is he a
heartbroken.
public figure?
No.
Okay, okay.
Italians, they just want to know everything.
I just wonder if it's a public figure because I wait, let me see if I can find it. Let's see.
Yeah.
Where's
Well,
the super
anyhow,
nerd?
I had
The
to
AB crowd.
convince them.
Imagine inviting someone to your show to speak ill of your biological father. Would be sinful. How does God see slander of vicar? Yeah. And yes, of your father. How about this one? King David, it's because of Saul. Saul. Because he says the Pope's Pope Leo.
we're not gonna do this tonight.
my question, I guess, to that whole train of thought, and I don't know, and I want you to continue your story, Eric, because it sounds interesting. But my whole question, I guess, to that crowd is something I posed in one of my videos recently, which is, do you believe that the Pope is even capable of sin? At this point, I mean, and again, it maybe sounds somewhat hyperbolic to the theologically trained mind, but at the same time, sometimes you got to wonder. You really got to wonder.
Yeah, well, I'll quote Michael Lofton here because years ago, when people used to ask him why he would comment on Pope Francis, and I thought he had the best response. He said, "Look, we honor our fathers as much as we can. We cover our father's nakedness like Noah's sons, right? But when your father is streaking in the middle of New York City and everyone's watching him on national television, there comes a point where you can no longer just look at the world and say, no comment."
Yeah.
No, no comment. There comes a point where the truth is being so maligned, even if not directly. And that's what I'm saying. We're in the tyranny of indirect assault.
Yeah.
Because you can't find, I mean, there might be an exception with the death penalty issue, right? But it's like we don't have heretics like they should. Like Arius was a heretic by bold affirmation, right?
Yeah.
I believe there was a time the Son was not.
Mm-hmm.
The heretics today, unfortunately, are not like that. They're saying they believe the dogma, every jot and tittle of dogma. And so the way they come out is very different than the way that the ancient arch heretics used to come out.
Yeah.
And, I forgot where I was going with this, but there comes a time, and Lofton used to say, you can't be quiet anymore, because then it becomes a matter of you're being dishonest. You're also, it hurts. What happens when it happens with your kids? Like my kid went to school one day in high school, and he came back and he said, "Hey, there was a talk today about Pope Francis opening the doors to bless homosexual couples."
Mm-hmm.
And I was hoping that would never get to the ears of my son, right? Yeah. And he comes back with that. What am I going to say? Well, he meant the individuals.
Son, watch this 4-hour-long video. It will give you all the answers.
But even worse than that, there was a time where Francis said couples living in cohabitating couples receive the same grace of marriage.
They have the grace of marriage, yeah.
I mean, you cannot. I mean, you're talking about marriage, which is a reflection of the Trinity. It is a sacrament. How we are. It's quite literally the way we get to heaven if you are married. How does he say something like that?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, to Eric's point, when it comes to the heretics of old who would just kind of come out right there and say it, two things come to mind. One, again, neo-modernists cloak everything in ambiguous language for a reason. As Eric said, they will jot every tittle and say, I believe in all the dogmas of the faith, but we're going to use different words to explain them all to where in practice they're not the same thing at the end of the day. But then two, and I think that this is not talked about. We often talk about, does the Pope, can the Pope teach heresy? Can this prelate teach heresy, etc.? Those are good conversations to have. But we forget that there is a myriad of like 100 other theological censors in scholastic theology, many of which, right, are mortal sins that are concerning. Like, is something temerarious? Is something proximate to heresy? Is something, against Catholic moral? I mean, even just something like, does this smack of heresy? Is it against pious ears, et cetera, et cetera?
Oh,
We
Yeah,
don't
we don't
even
hear that anymore. Is this against pious ears? Well, I want to make sure we get to
Exactly.
this because it's a super chat. Have you guys ever looked into the heresy of Febronianism, which restricts the power of the papacy, German movement from the 18th century? I've never heard of it.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's mentioned in again, these scholastic manuals in various sections on what they call the adversaries, and it's essentially a movement. It's kind of like what's a good way? It's kind of like the German version of Gallicanism,
Yeah.
to a certain degree, where or even like Americanism, in the sense that it's like, okay, let's make kind of a certain step close to the separation of church and state. Maybe we won't go all the way like Pius the Ninth was condemning, but we'll have a certain separation of church and state, and therefore in its practice, the Pope's power when it comes to the appointment of bishops, the kind of the daily functions of the church are going to be more limited. Hey, there you go.
I got more than a jersey, Kennedy. I don't know what you're talking about.
So I appreciate the calls to respect our father and the virtue of being not to speak evil of dignitaries, like Scripture says, honor our elders. All that applies, but I think Nick was alluding to this. So, is there no conditions
Yeah.
where something more is called for? From the same sanctified motive, and of course, the guy who's calling for you to always speak well of your father, he himself would say that on the level of the family, if a father were a murderer, a rapist, think of all the great evils that
Yeah.
a father can commit against children and against family, to the point where you have to speak about it.
Yeah.
And so that wouldn't violate the obligations of a son or a daughter, would it? And so why is it that on the level of in the church, everything is so supernaturalized in the papacy that you can't have a situation like that?
Now, would you defend your priest who's doing these things? No, but just the papacy has this special thing that we're not. Would you
Or a
defend the
bishop?
nakedness of a
No.
priest?
Well,
Your
look,
father?
reason in theology goes after cardinals and archbishops and bishops,
Yeah.
but if it and
Church
I'm not
militant did the same thing. Church militant would do the same thing. There was this boundary you couldn't cross with the Pope, but you could go after every single bishop. You could, and I don't see how the rule is different if it's
and so much of this is
your
in
rightful authority.
Yeah, and so much, and Eric's brought this up in other shows before. So much of this defending the Pope, particularly in the more academic settings of the papal safety theories and things along that nature, they're very much so the opinions of theologians, but we're seeing chaos exude itself in real time. And to just throw out some opinions of theologians and say, okay, the Pope can never sin, etc. Okay, my question is 2 points of scripture. Number one, to Eric's point, do not accuse an elder without the witnesses of 2 or 3 brethren, right? And don't do this lightly. It's not a light thing to accuse an elder, to accuse a priest in the Lord. But at the same time, the same apostle says that if you see a brother sinning, right, you even sometimes have to rebuke him to his face so that other people will not sin. I'm not saying that we should all laud ourselves over the Pope. We're not above the Pope, etc. God has instituted a monarchical church. But does that prescription no longer fall to the papacy? And again, it goes back to my point, like, can they even get, this may sound hyperbolic, but it's a good question. It's like, can the Pope even lie in these, in these, when you get to the logical extreme of defending the Pope on everything he says, it's like, do you even believe that the Pope can misspeak in a way where it can truly hurt somebody?
That's actually a really good point right here. Our threshold for heresy has really been that's not, it's not technically heresy, but it's like it would have been called heresy in times past.
But it's like, even like I said, all the various different scholastic censors that would be applied to this, you don't want to end up in those things either, because like heresy is bad, right? Because you're denying an explicit dogma of faith. But, proximate to heresy is pretty bad too, because it's an indirect attack against the virtue of faith. Even just the mortal sin of temerity is pretty bad because you're in mortal sin. So like in these documents that are being released from the Vatican, are they applying scholastic censors and scholastic, precision to every single one of these points so that not just clarity takes place, but also that they protect their souls by not saying something that could be against something that was actually taught on a higher level? It's just me thinking out loud, but
I also think having these conversations amongst brothers, Catholic brothers, is one thing. And I don't think we should have these conversations in front of outsiders, but like, we're in the family. Why can't we discuss some of these? Sometimes, if my father's an alcoholic, me and my brothers will get together and be like, all right, we got to discuss what's going on with dad.
Listen, I have a couple of Protestant guys who reached out to me on X, but Twitter now we call X, a couple months ago, and we sat down at a Starbucks and we got to talking about Catholicism. One of them's interested in converting to Catholicism. Then both of them came over to my house recently, and I won't disclose their names, but they're asking me, what about Pope Francis? They are very attracted to Catholicism, but it's like, what about Pope Francis? And if I sit there and do if you really listen to what he's saying, or if you really say, like recently there was a report where he said that homosexuals have the grace of love together, or the love of life. They enjoy the love. I think it's the gift of love. Yeah. They enjoy the gift of love in this kind of thing. And I'm gonna, what am I gonna do? Sit there and say, well, what he meant was they enjoy being loved by God.
Yeah.
And the context is clear. Everybody's gonna raise an eyebrow at me saying that means the gift of God's love. That's going to hurt our credibility.
Yeah.
And so it's at the point now where, what do you say? Oh, I'm sorry, we don't talk about the Pope in my house.
Yeah.
They'd be like, whoa, okay, never talk to this guy again.
Mm-hmm.
I found what I just do is I go, yeah, but did you see what he said about faggotry? He just
I don't have any doubts. I don't have any doubts that he has said that, but I also don't have any doubts about his praise of Father James Martin.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. Every June, every Pride Month, we get our endorsement of Father Martin. Every June, like clockwork. He did it this week. It's like he makes that comment, and then it's like, come on, James.
But see, this. I was talking about with a friend today. This is why people who maybe even aren't really into the niche realms of ecclesiology are confused, because simultaneously, you're right, you have two comments kind of within these last 2 weeks of Pope Francis saying this, so, behind closed doors, etc., about homosexuals. But then in tandem with this, you have 3 homosexual activists promoted to the DDF. Father James Martin gets an endorsement and a preface in his book. A gay seminarian who's openly gay is told, yeah, keep going. We're right behind you, if you will. What is this? And so this, to me, I can try to read. You can try to do what Lofton does, where it, I remember one time one of his arguments was, well, he doesn't have access to the internet, so he doesn't know who Father James Martin is. And it's like, okay, well, that's one argument you could have, I guess. But I think the better argument is that Pope Francis is a politician. Like, all popes are politicians, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a dirty word, right? All popes are politicians in some sense. But, politically savvy, probably behind closed doors, he doesn't really care a ton, unless he thinks that the majority of, quote, Catholics are going this direction. Then he'll acquiesce to a degree to make them feel better. Plus, as I've said before, if he comes down tomorrow like St. Pius X and he's just like, yes, here's my 170 condemnations of the LGBTQ movement, right? In official capacity, where we're condemning everything, the UN is going to say the Catholic Church is an offensive Westboro Baptist bigoted church. We need to like clamp down on them. No more funding for them in countries that fund buildings, etc. That's what happened. And so I think that for him, it's just like, okay, what is more politically savvy?
Okay, before I get final thoughts, because we're coming up on an hour and a half, before I get final thoughts, Tuesday night, we're going to, it's probably going to be just me and Rob. We're going to have to talk about some of the things Jeremiah Bannister said on his stream the other day. Me and Rob used to be contributors at Meaning of Catholic. We're no longer contributors there. I pulled out of there after this most recent episode. So Tuesday night, we're going to go through some of Jeremiah's clips. He misrepresented a bunch of things. He talked about things that were said in private between him and I, and didn't accurately portray them. And there's a whole bunch of things that I want to get into. So we're going to do that Tuesday. I didn't want to do that with Eric here. I don't want to put him on the spot. He has nothing to do with that. So I didn't do that tonight. For both of you, closing thoughts. Where do you think we go from here, man? Like, I'm just so done with papal documents. It's like, will this papacy just wrap it up?
Eric's the guest. I'll have him go first.
Yeah, thank you. So as far as the document goes, it's going to be the document on the Bishop of Rome. It's going to be used by the Orthodox. I have no doubt that Jay Dyer, for example, is going to use this as another opportunity.
That's going to be frustrating.
But you know what? I let them chew on the bone, right? Because this is the pain that our hierarchs are putting us through, in a sense. And so in a sense, I don't approve of that kind of misrepresentation, but I'm going to take the pain. I'm going to take the pain because this is kind of what we're going through right now. But it's going to be misused in that way. But it's important to remember that it's not even a joint declaration. The Cuba agreement that Patriarch Kirill and Pope Francis did together had more authority than this. This is just a study document surveying all kinds of different views. A lot of it is contrary to Catholic doctrine. And the document doesn't seem to be wanting to express any awareness of that. And so it's just another exercise in, hey, let's hear what you have to say at the end of the day. So that's what I have to say about the document. And closing thoughts and everything else. Nothing other than that, I've got a lot of projects I want to do. I'm a working man. A lot of people don't realize this, but I turn wrenches for a living. I work in industrial machinery. I'm a grease monkey from morning to evening. So
yeah, I do paving. I'm in construction. So this is.
Oh yeah, there you go.
It's very difficult to do these.
If people think I read when I'm not on a camera, and so, but I do have some projects I'm going to be commenting more on in relation to this stuff. So just keep tabs of my.
People are asking if you have another book coming out or anything. Or...
Yeah, I'm writing a book on Honorius and Vigilius. I'm also studying for a book on divorce and remarriage in the Church Fathers. But this is coming down the line. So yeah.
Okay. That's awesome. Yeah, my final thoughts first and foremost, and don't take this as flattery, because it's not, carnal flattery, but I really enjoy the work of Erick Ybarra. I have for a really long time, so much so that actually it's funny, every time I mean, like someone recognizes me or something like that, and we kind of get into a talk about, kind of nerdy Catholic YouTube, I always have someone generally bring up, hey, do you know Erick Ybarra? And I'm like, oh, I know him, but I've never actually like talked to him. This was before we became friends online. I've never done a stream with him, but everyone always tells me the same thing. He is like a very charitable, nice dude. And I'm like, yeah, everything I've seen of him, he's just a really nice, charitable dude, yeah,
Eric, you have a really stellar reputation out there.
Yeah.
And like everybody I talk to, they're like, yeah, he's got a great take on things. He's not, he's always charitable in his approach, but he's not sugarcoating anything. He understands where everything is. I'm glad that we're becoming friends, Eric. I always enjoy talking to you, man.
Yeah.
Hey, man, if I could help, I'm happy to.
Yeah, for sure.
Go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to say, I guess my final thoughts, at least when it comes to the document, is more so recommendations for people, which is first and foremost, yes, remember, this is not like this document has no magisterial weight. It is a study with some recommendations. That's all it is, and I don't. And so people.
Eric is my favorite heretic friend.
Oh, brother.
He and I have our theological debates in private chat all day.
Our disputation.
He's my favorite Yazzie brother. So I mean,
I've seen the thumbnail a lot. I've actually never interacted.
That's Enoch's brother.
Oh, okay. Oh, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say remember that, people, because again, you will see people, including Catholics, who will run with this and think that, this is the absolute end of the world. It is not the end of the world. I mean, in comparison to fiducia, like, come on, this is more nerdy than fiducia. And it's not that this is not important, as we've discussed, like it is very important, but you also got to just take a chill pill and remember that at the end of the day, the spiritual life, becoming a saint, becoming a disciple of our Lord Jesus Christ, doing what he did, or as 1 John talks about, walking as he walked. That's infinitely more important than these nerdy debates. Not trying to downplay them. And if these nerdy debates are causing you to, doubt the promises of Christ, one, seek out the spiritual life, but then two, I would recommend people to actually go and study good, legitimate ecclesiology so that they'll be able to navigate these things. And final thing I would say is, when it comes to all of this, remember, this stuff doesn't come out of nowhere. I believe, and it's my assertion, that a lot of it is rooted in the wedding of the church and the world through a neo-modernistic framework. That's my opinion. However, the solution, of course, is the person of Christ, the person of Christ who, at the end of the day, has entrusted the Holy Ghost to preserve and to guide his church so that the gates of hell would not prevail over it. And so pray for the day where not just the liturgy would be restored, but also scholasticism would be restored, because then we'll get out of this pit.
If you're somebody struggling with your faith, what I'll say is you're living through one of the most exciting times in church history, man. You guys are alive for a very, very this period will be written about for centuries. It will just be broken down, and we'll be the saints who lived through it.
What will be hilarious is that they'll
willing.
be like, yeah, there wasn't a ton of like hardcore scholastic disputation in the dicastery for the doctrine of faith. It was a bunch of YouTubers who were debating on what should be happening.
They will be dissecting this stream 200 years from now, guys. Man, Eric, thank you for giving it. Thank you both for carrying the weight tonight, because I had a long day at work today. I didn't get to check the document out, and you guys definitely brought a lot more to the table than I did tonight. So thank you both for coming on. Eric, you got anything to promote?
No. Just I have a Patreon. If it's a very humble one. If you check it out, I'm lecturing through my papacy book. So just that.
Okay. Yeah, and everybody, Nick has a Patreon too. So go subscribe to the Traditional Thomist on YouTube. Nick also has a Patreon, and Nick does not get a penny for coming on with us every single week. So if you guys want to give him a one-time donation, that would be great. Guys, we'll see you guys on Tuesday, where we are going to go through Jeremiah Bannister's recent meltdown on air. And I'll tell you guys about some of the stuff that's been going on behind the scenes. Not to gossip, but some things do need to be clarified that he said. So we will see you guys on Tuesday. And let me see if I can figure out how to take us out here. Let's see. Oh, man. All right. Let's go with Enoch since Elijah's in the chat.
This goes out to all you men out there who are inclined to submit yourself to the lowest faculties in the most pathetic manner. You effeminate man think you were created in order to consume endless amount of pleasure without any consequences? Put your damn video games and smartphones down and pick up something heavy. Do something arduous for once. Pray daily. Submit yourself under the interior discipline. Learn a trade. Buy some land. Get married.